Hi there, Stanton here from Algotrading. Today we are going to be starting a new series called Building a Crypto EA from Scratch. I'm going to try to keep the videos as short as possible so they keep them engaging. We're going to be doing a couple of videos how to do this. Also at some point we're going to be cheating a little bit. I'm going to be giving you guys our starter template so that you don't have to worry about a lot of the functionality that you need in order to create an EA. But before that, I want to get into some basic terminology and features of MT5 because it will help you understand the starter template a lot better. Alright, so let's get into it. Okay, so this is your MT5 editor. This is where you essentially create your expert advisors. So to create a new expert advisor, so let's just create a new folder here. New folder, we're going to call this our Crypto EA. Let me just move this up so you guys can see a little bit. It's going to be called Crypto EA. And what you need to do, you need to create it in this experts folder. Did that actually create it? No. So we're going to create a new folder, call it Crypto EA. Okay, and that's going to be the basis of our folder. Then what you need to do, you need to right click on the folder and you say new file. And there's a couple of files you could choose. You could use a script, include whatever else there is, or you could generate an EA from the MQL5 wizard, but we're going to be starting from scratch. So we're going to say create a new expert advisor based on a template. Then what you can do, we're also going to call it Crypto EA. And then you put like who's the author, you could put some copyright information, and you could put some a link to your website or whatever you want to do. Can add some parameters, but I'm going to do that manually to show you how that works. Okay, so we click next. We're going to just leave everything as default. Okay, so this is the start of your EA. Now there is three main sections of the EA. There's this on init. So basically every time you run the algo or load the EA onto a chart, this on init will run. Then you've got your on dinit. So what happens is that this method runs when you remove your EA from a chart or close the chart that an EA is attached to. And then this is the main function of your EA. This is your, what you call it, your tick function. So every time a tick happens inside your expert advisor, or every time a tick happens on the chart, it will call this function. Okay, so that is the main body, the three main functions of the expert advisor. So now what we're going to start with is, now this is very basic, there's nothing happening here, and that is all you could see to begin with. Now what we're going to start with is input parameters. Now input parameters are inputs that you can use to configure your expert advisor. For instance, if you've seen some of the expert advisor, you could put in your stop loss, your take profit, all of those things. But you don't want those to be fixed. You want to be able to edit them. So the first thing you need to do is create inputs. So we'll just give us some space here. And how you create an input is you type in the word input. And I like to put a group first. And then you call this my inputs. Okay, so if we compile that and we go to our meta editor now, you should see, if we refresh this folder, you should see our Crypto EA folder. And then if you want to see the inputs, you could just right click, you say test, you go to the inputs, and then you can see it has put a grouping of my inputs. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to add an input. So we're going to do something very basic just to show you some of the functionality and how inputs work. So you put input, we're going to do an integer. So there's a couple of types of input. There's actually many types of input. You've got a double, which is a sort of like a decimal. So if you want to use stop losses or if you want to use percentages, the double would be the best one to use. You've got strings, which is obviously it's just a string input. Strings are just normal words. You've got a ulong, which is it's kind of like a double, but it gives you more characters. There's a lot we need to use. I will show you all the different inputs as we get more into the development of an EA, but for now I'm going to use an integer. So integer is just it's just a number. So we're just going to call this the start counter. And what I like to do just while we're here is I like to make it so we know that it's an input. So I go inp underscore start counter. And then what you can do is you could give it a default value. So we just say it's 0. And then always put, I don't even know what these things are called, semicolons after your input parameter. And then to name it, just put 2 forward slashes. And then this is going to be the start of our counter. Okay, now we're going to compile it again, and we'll go to our, and then you could see, yeah, we've got our start of our counter. Now you could change the value where you want it to start. By default, if you right click and say go to defaults, it sets it to 0. So that essentially is input parameters. We're going to go more in depth in input parameters, but I just need to understand the concept of how to set these up and what each one does. So this is essentially our first EA. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our coding, and then what we're going to do now, we're going to use that counter. Okay. So those are input parameters. Now you've got a concept called variables. Now variables, there's two types of variables. There's global variables, which you'll declare here. So a variable is the same as the input, but you don't have the word input in front of it. So we're going to call a variable as int. A lot of people like to name their variables m underscore something, but you can name it whatever you want. But so this is going to be m underscore counter equals to 0. So the difference between an input is it's a variable that you can adjust. A variable, you cannot adjust it now in the inputs. It is just a variable. It's you setting a placeholder essentially for something that you're going to set later on. Now declaring the variable sets it as a global variable. So m counter throughout the whole lifetime of this EA running will always be 0 unless you set it to something else. So these are called global variables. Now what you have, if you go into your integ function, we could declare another integer, and we'll call this one we call it, I don't know, let's call it, so you've got a global variable and you've got it's called a closed variable, where it only gets declared every time this onTick function runs. So global variable never changes. A closed variable will change every time this is, so we're going to say our local counter equals 0. Okay, so now we've got 3 different types of variable. We've got an input variable, which is our input. We've got a global variable, and we have got a local counter. So let's just print that out. So we could just see print. Okay, so our input, equals us. So the first one we're going to use the INP underscore start counter. Then we've got our global equals, and now to add a variable to a string, what you need to do is close the string off and then put a plus sign. And then we're going to have our, what did we call it? We called it the M underscore counter. And then our last one, is the local. So the local only gets reset every time you call this onTick function. Local equals plus local counter. Okay, so now we're going to compile that. I didn't close something. Always need to put. Okay, it's complaining that it's converting into a string, but that doesn't really matter. So now what we're going to do, we're going to go back to our, EA. We're just going to run it on anything. Let's run it on BTC. We're going to set our start counter. We're going to just start it at 0, and we're just going to visualize the running of it. And then you're going to see that it's going to print there, it's printing out. So the input is 0, global is 0, and you can see how many times that onTick function is being called. Global is 0 and the local is 0. So they're all 0 right now. So let's stop this. And let's do some calculations now. So what we're going to do now, we're going to set our counter to be equal to our start counter. So the start counter will always be 0, but we're setting our global counter to 0. And then what we're going to do now is, so each time we come into this equals M underscore counter plus 1. And then what I'm going to also do here is set let me just make a space here. What I'm going to do now, so every time it goes into this onTick function, we're going to increment the counter by 1. So let's compile that. Let's go into our, let's run our code. You can see there. can see how many times the onTick function is being called. So the input is still 0, but the global counter is being incremented by 1 each time the onTick function is being called. So you can see now we are incrementing the 1. Okay, so that is, so what we've covered over here is concept of, and then what we could also do here is we're going to increment the local counter by 1. So local counter plus 1. We're going to set the local counter equals the local counter plus 1. And then what you're going to see now will explain what I meant by, the closed variable is that, well, let me just show you and it will explain it. We're going to run our EA again. Go to our journal. See, it is resetting the local counter every time back to 0. So that, what I'm showing you is that that local counter gets reset every single time this function gets called. So the local counter is 0 equals local counter plus 1. So 0 plus 1. Okay, so that is the concept of, let me just stop this. Okay, so that is the concept of parameters. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to now talk about a concept called functions. I just want to check something quickly. Okay, so there's a lot of calculations that need to happen in an EA, and you don't want to put everything into this onTick, because this is the core of the functionality. So what you essentially want to do is you want to move it out to a thing called a function, so that you haven't got all this logic running in your onTick function. As you can see in my Multifarious EA, there's a lot of stuff happening, and you don't want to have it all sitting in your onTick function. So what you need to do, you need to break it down into functions. So separate the logic, basically. So what I'm going to do here is go void, and we're going to call this counter. We're not going to pass any parameters to it. And if you want to neaten up your code a bit, you could do that. And then we're going to remove that. We don't need that. We're not going to use the local counter anymore. We're going to take that. We're going to copy that out of here. We're going to paste it into our function. And we're not going to use the local counter anymore. So let's just end it at the... So now, the onTick function, we've got a new function called counter. Now if we want to call that function from the onTick thing, we just say counter. And you could add as many functions, you could call functions within functions, but this is the concept of a function. So now what's going to happen is that every time the onTick function is called, it's going to call this counter function, which is basically going to run that code inside the counter function. So if we run the backtest now, we should get the exact same results as we were getting before. So Let's run it. And you can see here the input is 0 and the global is counting up. So exactly the same functionality we had before, but the code is a lot neater now, and we've now moved the onTick function, so we're not cluttering up the onTick function, and we're running that code now with inside a separate function. Okay, so that is functions. The last thing I want to just show you quickly is, setting this to be a certain variable. So I'm going to stop the backtest, close that. Now, if I compile that, and we go back to our main trading platform, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set an input here, and I'm going to start it at, to say, 10,000. Okay, if we now start the backtest with the visualizer on, you will see now the counter starts at 10,000. So the input is 10,000, and the global is adding 1 to the input every time the onTick function is called. All right, so we have covered quite a bit, but we are covering probably the three most important topics when it comes to developing an EA. Is that the use of the inputs, our global variables. We've talked about the main body and what all of it does, and we've moved our functionality from the onTick function into a sub-function that will not, so that we don't have our onTick function as cluttered as it would be. Another thing what you can do is on the init, instead of declaring it here, you would declare your function inside the init. So, you could declare it over here, or you could declare it inside the onInit function, or what you would do in some cases, you would actually declare the counter and you would set it with inside the init function. So if that's also, it's a much cleaner way of doing it, because you've declared it once, and then when you load the EA onto a chart, it will then set your counter to be your start counter. So if I compile that now again, and we run the code, so just see how I'm running it, is that you take you're going to a backtest, and you would set your Visual Studio on. Your visual mode on. And let's run it again, and you'll see we'll have the exact same results. And there you have it. Alright guys, so that is our introduction to MQL5 programming. Very basic to start off with, but we are going to go into more depth in the next lesson. The reason why I showed you these main components is because our starter template is built up with a lot of functions, a lot of inputs, a lot of variables, and I think getting a basic understanding of these terminologies will help you to understand the starter template a lot better. So like, subscribe. We're going to be doing a whole series on these, and hope to see you guys soon. Cheers.